I would now like to request our next speaker, Kira G, Research Associate at Helmholtz-Zentrum Gstaad, Germany. I'm sure I just completely butchered that, but Kira, floor is all yours. Sorry, I wasn't unmuted, sorry. Okay. So my talk is presenting an approach that was developed by a group of people who are, in fact, an ICES working group, working also with the LOIX program a few years back. Sorry, can you enlarge your screen to make it wide? Sorry. Is that better? Yeah, much better. Thank you. Okay, right. Yes, so I'm presenting on behalf of a larger group, really, that came up with this concept of culturally significant areas. It came very much from an MSP type thinking, recognizing that MSP plans usually rely on a lot of ecological type input and assessments like conflicts, cumulative impacts, pressures, and of course also the economic side of things, as we've heard in the previous presentation. But one thing that struck us really is that non-material values, anything that relates to culture in the wider sense, and in particular the affective or emotional dimensions or relationships people have with the sea, tend to be underrepresented. So we thought, okay, if we assume that MSP is happening and we want to broaden how MSP is being done, then here are some of the key requirements. So we first of all need to have a better definition of what exactly are these cultural values we're talking about and how they manifest in space, because MSP, after all, it's a spatial approach, and if you want to have those values included, it's probably a good idea to make them available as some sort of a spatialized entity. But then beyond defining what exactly these values might be, it's also necessary to perhaps assess which of these values might be more important than others, in the sense of balancing and trying to come to a compromise probably also as to what's achievable and what isn't. So we came up with this sort of maybe it's possible to identify areas that are of very high cultural significance for some reason or other, or maybe areas that aren't quite so important culturally, just like you would with ecologically significant areas in a way. And once such areas have been identified, so that was our thinking, then, of course, the next step would be to say, okay, what kind of activities, what kind of uses might pose a risk to the values you're trying to highlight or protect through MSP. So this group of people I was part of defined a culturally significant area quite simply, really, as an area that either contains a culturally significant feature or is a feature in its own right. And that might be something like a landscape, for example, or a heritage area. And we also very quickly realized that significance is such a difficult term, and it's not something that can be prescribed in any way at all, but it has to really come from the connection that communities or people have with the ocean or with an area. So from the beginning, it was very clear that anything related to cultural values or significance has to be done in a truly inclusive process. So something that uses locally relevant thoughts, locally relevant values, and also classifications. So we thought, okay, if you're really going to do this as part of an MSP process, what are the logical steps that are needed? So the first thing we thought, okay, also similar to ecological assessment, is let's establish a baseline of some sort to identify in a planning region, let's say, what exactly are the various features that could be of importance. So the questions are here. So the first question is, well, what exactly is it? That's of value. Next question is, where is it in space? Also, when? It might be a temporal thing or something that isn't always available or important, like a tradition. And then it's also been touched upon in the previous presentations, who actually finds this important? Who really is the community that values this? And in the last questions, okay, well, what does it need, this thing, to really sustain it into the future for the people who value it? So that's what is necessary, we thought, to establish some sort of an overview, a kind of a baseline survey type thing. And one of the common approaches or ways of doing this is to do participatory mapping type exercises. Here's an example from Sweden that a student of ours did. But there's also other ways of doing it. Obviously, there's you know, you can just talk to people. You can do storytelling. You can use pictures, legends, myths, photographs. All sorts of things can be used to actually elicit those types of values. But the mapping of these values and the identification of them is really only the first step, and that's really, I guess, my key message for today. It's to say that really what's important is to then take the next step and try to identify, okay, which of these values, if you had to make a choice, and usually MSP is about making a choice. Usually we probably don't get everything that we might wish for. So if we have to make a choice, which ones, which values, which areas are super important and really must be kept for the community that values them? And we thought, okay, well, how do we actually do this? What kind of criteria can we use? Also to make this a little bit comparable. So if you have very different value sets, it might be tricky to communicate that and to actually say, okay, well, how are they on a par? How can they be compared to each other? So here we drew up a list of what we think are pretty universal criteria that could be used. And here they are. I'm just going to go through the first two because 10 minutes is rather short. So cultural uniqueness is one, and it's very familiar to anyone who does ecological assessment. There's also a criteria related to ecological uniqueness, for example, in the context of EBSA. So translating that, the question here is, okay, the extent to which a feature or a place or an activity is unique within the planning region or not. So here on the right-hand side in that table, you see some slightly more elaborate description of what that might mean. So we're talking really of values or features or places that really are irreplaceable. There's only one of them, and that is why it is of very high cultural significance. And you can see a list of some examples: burial grounds, archaeological sites, but it could be anything that the community deems important. It could be a tradition. It's unique also maybe to a particular culture or a particular group of people. And here we see, I've just listed indigenous cultures, but also it could be, I don't know, a sports group. And there's a difference also in terms of the scale. It could be unique in a very local context, but it could also be unique in a global context. On top of doing this type of assessment, there's also a number of other attributes that are quite important to consider, and that would be the spatial extent of the thing that is of value. So the area boundaries, the temporal scale, whether something may be seasonal, for example, in its importance, and that's the link back to the environmental dimension also, the link to a particular environmental quality that the cultural values might need. And there we can easily relate that to fishing activities, to things like salmon spawning, to all kinds of traditional activities that really require a particular environmental quality as well. So that has nothing to do with the culturally significant area necessarily. It may be something that is sort of quite, well, sort of general, really, in a way, that also has to come into play. So here's a summary, really, of the stages, I suppose, or the steps that this methodology has. So The baseline would be the first one, then the application of these criteria to pick out the ones that really are going to matter, which are then going to be fed into something like an MSP process, possibly. And then as the next stage is some sort of a risk assessment to determine what might be threats, and then integration into management and planning. Before I come to the thank you, I also want to say that, well, I want to highlight some of the advantages maybe and the issues, I guess, this type of approach might have. And the advantage obviously being that it does translate something that tends to be quite intangible, something that has a lot to do with emotional connections, perceptions. Earlier we heard the term relational values with the C, all of those things that are non-monetary. It might be a way of translating that into the language of spatial management. So it's a way of actually highlighting that these things are important. And it's also a way of connecting this with the communities or with different communities that actually place a value on these things. So it's a way of actually giving voice to something that does tend to get overlooked quite a lot in at least Northern European spatial planning exercises. The trouble in a way with that approach is that it does assume that MSP is MSP, and it doesn't really question some of the basic assumptions that MSP makes. So, you know, the area-based approach, the fact that everything has to be spatialized, that MSP speaks a particular language. It also doesn't do away with problems of...
Thank you.
Doesn't do away with problems like, you know, how do you really weigh this against strong economic players, strong economic values that also come into play as well. So it doesn't take away any of that, but it might be an initial step that can be taken and can be useful, possibly, first of all, for engaging with people at a different level, and then secondly, to build that bridge between those communities and those types of values and the more technical, also more technocratic MSPing that I guess Northern Europe at least has been used to in the past. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kira. If you could
sorry, go on. I just realized I shared the wrong presentation, but I hope it was useful anyway.
Yes.
I made some slightly different slides and they had pictures on them, so you didn't get to see the pictures.
Right. Are you able to not like, yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much, Kira.